Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
What were you arguing about on the way? I just love this comment of Jesus. Jesus' comment is such a human thing to say to our friends or family in the middle of a conversation with many at the table when we find ourselves distracted, saying, "What were you arguing about?" Jesus' words make it appear as if he was not listening to the disciples as they talked with one another. Yet Jesus' next response seems to suggest that he was listening quite closely to know that they were arguing with one another. Jesus remained apart, but apparently fully present. In church conflict language, we would say Jesus maintained a non-anxious presence as he and the disciples walked along with one another. Jesus did not get hooked or triggered by the disciples' arguments. He maintained his presence without anxiety. Jesus was able to stay in relationship with the disciples, apart from the center of their attentions. Jesus demonstrates his differentiation from the disciples' argumentative friction with one another when he is able to challenge them about what they spoke about. Jesus is not enmeshed in the argument, so he is able to listen more deeply. He shows them and us that he was listening. He knows they were arguing about who was the greatest. Growing up as the youngest in my family, I often heard from adults around me, I'm sure you're familiar with this line, "Children are to be seen and not heard." These words always hurt me because I felt of little value, for I was not privileged to speak. As the youngest, I was often thought to have little to say. From other sermons, you know, I suffered from a stutter until I was 6 years old. No doubt my stutter influenced those around the table. He can't speak. Indeed, at my family table over many years, I remember hardly saying a word. And yet, I was not absent. I stayed present and heard everything that was said. At my family table, I developed a passion that I would only many years later discover. I had developed a passion for those who are not at the table, for those who, though at the table, are not granted the privilege to speak. Indeed, the passion behind the theology I practice in this parish, as well as in Kenya and other places throughout the global South, I first found by being ignored at my family table. Out of years of silence, I have a passion to open up spaces once reserved for a few to the many. Here in this parish, it is the passion behind my commitment to lay preachers and inviting an ever-increasing number of members into lay leadership. But this gospel is not all about me. I have learned from those the world deems invisible, and I have participated in making some people invisible. We all have been like the disciples who ignore Jesus as they argue with one another. We have all been like Jesus too, set apart, wondering what the fuss is all about and even wondering what others are arguing about. We, like Jesus, even sometimes bring clarity out of confusion. In our earthly lives, there are many we systematically ignore at our own peril. Yes, we ignore others at our peril. The peril of our hearts and minds rooted in the Christ we seek to follow. I recall challenging ministry as a Jesuit chaplain at Goldwater Hospital on Roosevelt Island in New York City. Goldwater is the hospital where the poorest of the poor in New York City are sent for rehabilitation and sometimes, often, for the remainder of their life if they no longer have money, friends, or family to do otherwise. I remember Julia, a patient who could only speak with the help of a pointer held between her teeth as she pointed to letters on a chart to make simple sentences. Julia was ever patient, deliberately picking every letter to utter her meaning and feelings as a human being. To the contrary, as a young man, I was impatient, often frustrated by Julia's means of communication. I struggled listening to Julia. At the same time as I was a chaplain at Goldwater Hospital, I was a young Jesuit living in community with Jesuit scholars who were leaders in every field. And then twice a week, I found myself in the presence of Julia. As an immature young man at the age of 28, I paid little attention to Julia. I did my ministry duty, but really I missed Julia's story. I missed Julia's story at my own loss. I left the Jesuits in 1986. On one Sunday in 1997, I was reading the Sunday New York Times book review. In the book review, there was Julia's face on the cover of a best-selling book. Look up for Yes, the story of Julia Tavellaro. The cover of the book says this: 30 years ago left me in a coma. When I awoke, I found myself completely paralyzed and unable to speak. For 6 years, I was considered brain dead. I was not. As time went by, I forgot the sound of my own voice. But now I have found it again. If you want to talk to me, look up for Yes. Look Up for Yes is the book where Julia tells her story about being systematically ignored for decades by nurses' aides, nurses, doctors, and even chaplains. This hospital is famous for 100 years of having Jesuit chaplains minister to people at their bedside. But no one could tell me how to be present to Julia. Julia had been in a coma for 30 years and then one day woke up paralyzed by 2 strokes, unable to speak. She went into a coma when she was 2 years old and woke up out of the coma at 32. 32 years old, Julia was a prisoner in her own body. As aides changed Julia's bed sheets, they referred to her as a vegetable, not knowing that she could not speak. She heard every word. Julia was intelligent and an emotionally deep woman. Have you ever been ignored, dismissed, and made to feel invisible? I've been ignored, but I have also ignored others. I have known deep pain when I was ignored, but I also knew deep pain in 1997 when Julia's story came before me in the New York Times Book Review. There is something to be learned from being ignored and our act of ignoring others. In this way, we are all able to resonate with Julia's story. Listen to Julia speak through the power of her spiritual autobiography. If you would, just let me read a half a page to you. They rolled me into a room I'd never seen before and lifted me onto a table. 2 women got on either side of me, each with her hands beneath my arms. Neither of them said anything to me. Someone counted to 3, and the woman tried to make my body sit up. As I screamed in pain, neither therapist stopped bending my back. They heaved against me, pulling my arms away from my chest. My shoulders contracted, and the muscles went tight. They bent and turned me, then stretched out my legs and bent them back. After searching a minute to find my left kneecap, they touched it and tried to relocate it. When they couldn't, they moved up to my hands and attempted to uncurl my fingers. I screamed and felt excruciating pain. I hoped to pass out, but the pain kept me conscious. They tried to move my legs up and down, turning my sockets. They continued down to my ankles, playing with my toes. I felt a burning sensation along the length of each leg. Though my feet veered inward toward the center of my body, they wanted to force alignment. When they bent my feet, I wanted to die. I screamed for them to stop. They continued. They spoke to each other in technical jargon, passive ROM and forearm pronation, forearm suspension, shoulder abduction to 30 degrees. None of this makes sense to me. Though my hands were tighter than loaded springs, the therapist again attempted to open them. Neither one recognized that I was screaming because the pain was so severe. They bent each of my fingers one by one until they got my left hand to move. "You see," said one to the other, "progress." The one who said this took a clipboard and wrote something down. "That's it for today. Let's get this mad dog back to her cage." Sounds a little bit like the reading of the Passion on Palm Sunday. Julia was ignored for decades, with no family at her bedside, no advocates for her care, and no parishioners to visit. And then one man, Richard Tayson, a poet, a journalist, heard about her, listened to her story, and helped her tell her story to the world. A poet, not a chaplain, not a doctor, not a nurse, not an aide, not a social worker. A poet helped Julia tell her story for all of us to hear. I was liberated by Julia's story, but also heartbroken that I did not take the time to get to know her when I was a chaplain. I was in a penitential sense sorry that I did not more pastorally listen and maybe break into her silence sooner. When I met Julia, I was focused on my own needs and not available to Julia. I was afraid of her differentness, her silence. I avoided her, and I was one of the many who was uncomfortable in her presence. Behind Julia's silence is the power of her invisibility, her story before God. The disciples probably thought Jesus was oblivious to their conversation, for he took no active part. Yet Jesus did not miss a heartbeat. He was listening, because the conversational tensions did not distract him. He was able to listen more deeply. Jesus was able to teach through his silence. Julia taught through her silence. Eventually, I was able to teach through my silence. How do we use our silence? Do we ignore one another, or through silence do we have the opportunity to listen more deeply? Do we choose to engage in arguments or listen until we have something to say so that what we say changes the entire conversation? Jesus doesn't just maintain the banter. He knows how to remain present, say nothing, and then ask a question that is a game changer. No, a heart changer. He always speaks and makes our hearts change. Julia's story changed the hearts of a few who read this book. How do you and I change the hearts of all around us? We begin by prayerfully meditating on today's gospel. We learn from the disciples and from Jesus. We search for invisible people in our midst. And from time to time, we confess when we have ignored others. We reconcile our desire to be heart healers with our desire to follow Christ. The good news today is that we do not make this journey alone, but follow Jesus. Follow Jesus in his silence. Follow Jesus ignoring in the most human sense. Follow Jesus in healing hearts. God bless you.